Well, these days it seems like there's lots of things to be anxious about. And so the title of the talk tonight is Anxiety, a Reasonable Approach or a Reasonable Response. So, yeah, life is, we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable beings in a world where um, lots of things can happen, right? Things that can cause us physical harm, injury, or illnesses. Um, there are things that can cause us harm to our sense of well-being. You know, if someone insults us or rejects us or ignores us or dismisses us or ridicules us, I mean, there's lots of possibilities there to feel hurt, right? So there can be just this sense of anxiousness, not quite knowing what might happen next, because it could be at any moment. It could be the next phone call. It could be the next um, news bite. It could be the next text. It could be um, the next thing that shows up when we're driving or talking to somebody. There are many possibilities, right? And it can be like just of a personal nature, or it could be even of a global nature. You know, we could be anxious about, you know, let's say knew we were going for a job interview next week, a job that we really wanted, um, and we could be prepared for it, but we still wouldn't know what might happen. Maybe they wouldn't like me. Maybe they found somebody better, you know, so that, you know, the outcome is uncertain. So we can be anxious about that, how that's going to turn out, just even on a common personal level. We could also be anxious about, you know, potential global disasters, you know, things that may not happen, but if they did happen, they could cause, you know, unimaginable suffering, absolute catastrophe, nuclear war, famine. You know, so in that case, we don't really have any control, and we could be reduced to worrying about whether that might happen or not. You know, the risk, you know, we may say, well, the risk is low, but if it did happen, it would be catastrophic. You know, who knows what would happen after that? And so we can spend, you know, a lot of energy sort of worrying that that might happen. But I'd suggest if something that we have no control over, you know, maybe we do. Maybe we're in a certain position that we can take some sort of action to do our small part to reduce that possibility. But um, probably for most of us, that there's um, not that apparent potential. So if we can truly recognize that, um, we can see that our anxiousness about what may happen um, doesn't resolve the issue, doesn't reduce the issue, and all it does is cause suffering here. So we can see that that sense of anxiousness. One of the characteristics of it is that it's always about the future. Right? If something's happening right now, we're not anxious about it. We either act or we don't, or you know, something's required. It's not like you know, that sense of anxiety is really directed for the future, and it's dependent on our imagination, like what could happen, you know, and we can come up with all kinds of possibilities that might happen. And actually, that capacity to sort of imagine what might happen in the future is it can be a valuable tool, right? It allows us to plan ahead, to have some contingencies, some plan Bs if our original idea doesn't quite work out. So all of that's valuable. It had a role in our evolution to be able to imagine what might happen, what might go counter to what we hoped, and what we might be able to do about it. So that all has a useful function. Um, but there can be two ways that can cause us suffering. One is when we use that skill excessively, like we can imagine, you know, instead of the three or four sort of most likely things that might cause a problem and how to deal with that. We might imagine, I don't know, 25 things, and our mind just spins out of control about all kinds of conceivable possibilities that might happen. The other way that it can cause us suffering is if we imagine that just because we can plan something for the future and imagine what might go wrong, or what we hope would go right, if we develop this sense of, well, then I should be able to control the outcome, or I am responsible for the outcome. That also causes us to suffer. Right? If we could control the outcome through our efforts, if we had that capacity, we could control every outcome. So we'd get every job that we wanted. When we invited people to a party, they would all come. everything that we did would turn out exactly like we wanted it to if we had control, right? And we know that's not true. That's not how things work. And even if it did work that way, how boring would it be to live in that world where everything that we wanted, we would be 100% assured that it would happen. We know that life doesn't work that way. So there can be this anxiousness. We can do what we do, and then there's still this sense of, yes, and I still wanted it to turn out the way I wanted to turn out. For whose benefit? Right? Most often it's for me, how I want it to turn out. So that sense of trying to control something when we know deep down that it doesn't work that way. We can influence the outcome, but we can't actually control it. So we can do whatever we can, make whatever efforts we can muster up to, accomplish what we'd like to do. All of that's wonderful. But at some point the outcome is not certain. We have to leave that one up to life at some point. So, and just on a practical basis, we can take certain precautions to reduce, possible negative outcomes. We can eat better and exercise, and not go skydiving and swimming with white sharks and etc. So, but at some point, there's still this anxiousness. It can be really subtle, just maybe a little murmur sometimes, or it can be, just escalate all the way up into outright terror. It sort of depends on how much we believe the stories that we're telling ourselves. It's in some ways, if we tell ourselves the appropriate story that we can truly believe, we can scare ourselves with it. And so as we proceed in this spiritual journey, at first it feels like it's not that threatening, right? We're sort of doing things that are at arm's length, like, listening to online discourses, for example. or reading books, or um, doing certain practices, or hanging out with a group of fellow seekers and being able to feel like we're doing that together. So all of those things are sort of out on the periphery. We can do those without feeling like, um, this is my essence at stake here. And so that can feel relatively non-threatening. But at some point, it that being satisfied with just working with things on the periphery is no longer satisfying. It no longer is enough to give us a sense of peace and rest. So even if there are prior realizations, theologies, certain practices like centering prayers that we can sort of use to pull ourselves back together again. At some point, those kinds of practices don't have the same effect that they may have had at one time. And what's being called for is to look deeper. And at that point, we may begin to sense that something more, you say more serious, but it's not really. Something more serious is being called for. Something deeper is being called for. And it can feel like, I just wanted to go back to where I was feeling good about this. I don't really want to sort of wade through the muck and visit things that I don't really want to visit, and look deeper, especially if it feels, that we're talking about me now. But if you've gotten to that point, it's probably too late to turn back. And even if you had the choice, would you? If you've seen what has been seen about oneself, about the mind, about thought, if you've had some degree of realization, would you turn back? Most of the time, if people actually consider that, they say, well, no, not really. I wouldn't want to go back to just being completely asleep at the wheel, right? And so then we're left with going forward, and that looks scary too. There was a Thailand Buddhist monk called Ajahn Chah, who said that there are two kinds of suffering. One kind is the suffering that we run away from, that will pursue you forever. And the other kind of suffering is the suffering that we face directly, and by doing so will make us free. So that's the point that we're talking about now. So it's not without anxiety, right? So we can have anxiety about just the sort of common everyday human things that are coming up in the near future, or maybe further down the line, or anxiety about the state of the world, all perfectly valid. But this, I would suggest that it's rooted ultimately in this deeper sense of our identity. And what we're talking about here is when we begin to approach that in a direct way, recognition of our identity, um, then there can be anxiousness, there can be fear, right? Just outright fear arise, because what it feels like is that it's no longer on the periphery that I'm working with in the spiritual world. It's about me, and it is my identity on the line. And we can read about different sages from the past that have um, passed through this point and survived long enough afterwards to write about it and grow old. And but some of what they say about it um, may not feel that comforting. I'll give you a few examples here. So the Sufis have the saying to die before you die, so that you may truly live. The philosopher, writer, German, von Goethe, said that so long as you haven't experienced this, to die and so to live and so to grow, you're only a troubled guest on this dark earth. Okay, Jesus is, whoever seeks to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. This is what he's talking about, right? Okay, last one. Lao Tzu, to die but not to perish is to be internally present. Okay, so all four of these sources, quite different traditions, are talking about some process that they're describing as dying. And so the question is, well, what actually dies, right? Because we're not talking about physical death here, because none of these quotes would make any sense at all if we're talking about physical death, right? So there's talking about some other form of transformation that has it's as transformative as physical death, maybe more so. So this, so we can look at this question about what dies. Well, the body, eventually the body clearly dies, right? So what they're talking about is not the body, right? And if the body dies, one of the things that goes with it is the capacity of the brain, which includes memory and the capacity of thought and the capacity of understanding. So if we're not talking about the death of the body, then we're also not talking about thought and memory and understanding, because those are all housed in the body. We're also not talking about an experience, because that too requires the body to have the perceptions and sensations that compose the experience, right? So what we're talking about is something other than thought and memory and understanding and experience. So those are what don't die. They don't die in that we're no longer able to access those functions. But what dies is the misunderstanding that what we are is this body-mind. That's what it is. We can call it something dramatic like ego death, but it's really it's not the death of this body. It's the death of simple misunderstanding. The death, the, the, the extinguishment of a false belief. And the false belief is what I am is limited to this body mind. But when we look at the one thing that we can actually be certain of, if we want to really start at ground zero, the one thing that we can really be certain of is that I am, right? You may not know what that is, but there's something here that is present in this moment, and that there's a sense of aliveness, a sense of existing, a sense of being, just a sense of I am. That's the one thing that we can be absolutely certain of. And within this capacity of awareness of this sense of I am is, because that sense of I am isn't I am this body. It's just when we back up far enough into this awareness, it's just the sense of beingness. The body comes later. The sense of being in this body is it's actually a thought, a thought that arises within this awareness. Often we're not walking around 24/7 saying, I am this body, I am this body. When we question it, we come back to it. Yeah, this is me, I know it. But what knows it is the recognition of that thought happens within awareness. So that's how we know that this body mind is present. It's present as an appearance within awareness, just like the tree, just like the clouds. There's a personal nature to it because the body has this capacity to, as a sensing organism, to be able to receive information. But that information is known only in awareness. So what is given up by whatever means is this belief that what I am is limited to this body and this mind. We find out that the body and the mind still exist. They're just not our primary home. But to arrive at that understanding may require us to move forward through fear. Because if everything that we've ever taken ourselves to be has been this body mind, even including the thoughts of, yes, but God is out there and the world is out there and I'm here. All of that is a function of this body mind. All thoughts about divinity, thoughts about who I am, all of that, it happens within this body mind. So if we've taken that to be what we are our entire life, and we get to a point in spirituality where that's questioned, it can be unnerving, let's say. Or we just reject it as an idea. Well, that can't be true. But I'd suggest, if we're really trying to figure out who we really truly are, if we don't know, we need to be open to the possibility, especially considering the number of sages in the past that have pointed to the same thing. So there's, I'm going to do a we're heavy on quotes tonight, but I've got a couple more that are relevant. One is in the Gospel of Philip, which is one of the Gnostic Gospels that was discovered this last century. Didn't make the cut into the New Testament, but in that Jesus is quoted as saying, "What you say in the body. You can say nothing outside of the body. You must awaken while in this body, for everything exists within it." And here's the kicker: resurrect in this life. So it's clearly not talking about dying to get to heaven, right? It's talking about resurrecting in this life, coming to a far deeper understanding, a shift in perspective into what we truly are, and using this lifetime productively to discover that. But I love the words resurrect in this life. Different meaning there than dying and then coming back into form again, not likely for the common person, but that's not what he's saying here. He's saying resurrect in this life. It's not about reaching peace and contentment in an afterlife, right? Because he goes on to say, heaven is spread upon the earth and men do not see it. Not far away, right? We don't have to die in hopes of reaching some state of peace. This lifetime, here and now. And we can say, yeah, but here and now feels a lot like me, and what's being asked for is to relinquish that sense of me. And so it can feel like our very existence is being challenged. And that can all sound real theoretical and philosophical and everything until we actually get to that point, and it can feel like our very life is being asked for. Not because it is, but because that's what we've taken ourselves to be. We've taken ourselves to be this body mind, and so if we're being asked to, maybe not even asked, not nicely, if we found ourselves backed into a corner where there is no other escape other than to let go, it can feel like our very essence is being asked for, demanded even. And that's grace. If it was up to us and we had an escape route, 99 times out of 100, we'd probably take it. So there's this sense of being willing to move forward, even in the face of fear, is what's being called for. Because the fear, normally, fear is something that is a sign that we ought to be careful, that there's danger lurking ahead, and that we need to be prepared to run away or defend ourselves somehow. But in this case, fear is what the mind is telling us, because the mind doesn't like to be put out of a job. If we've given the thinking mind the authority to tell us how things are, how things should be, our whole life, and we can see just far enough ahead to know that what's ahead is not subject to the thinking mind. It's beyond that. Mind doesn't like it. Mind reacts. We can call it thinking mind, we can call it ego, whatever. But ego is just a collection of thoughts, one of which is I am this body mind. Right? So if we've given the thinking mind that authority for the whole life, it certainly has great value. We're not denying that. We're also not talking about that. We're talking about that more fundamental reality that lies beyond the thinking mind. And the reason that we can say it lies beyond the thinking mind is that because it's talking about reality rather than our concepts about reality. And what the thinking mind can function in is only thought. If we really watch the mind, it's the mental occurrence of one word appearing after another word. It's very linear and almost continuous. Not quite, but almost. So what we can do is recognize that that is the capacity of the mind, beautiful capacity, right? To think, to plan, to understand, to learn, all of that beautiful, no question. Right? It's just when the thinking mind isn't required and it tends to run on, in repetitive fashion or run on about thoughts that we've thought about hundreds of times before, or we drop into blame or guilt or shoulds and shouldn'ts or hopes or dreams or arguments with life, etc. So those things, when we're opposing life, when we're fighting for what we want versus what life happens to be offering in that moment, when we oppose that, we suffer. So one of the things that we can notice is the only thing that has the capacity to make us suffer is thought. We might be in pain, right? We can break a leg and it's going to hurt. But what can often hurt even more is what we tell ourselves about the pain and why it shouldn't have happened, or what it confirms about me as a person, etc. So that second guessing and criticizing and judging and blaming, all of that only happens in thought. And thought only happens in the mind. And what we can notice when the mind stops for whatever reason, or when we're just not giving it the power of our belief, what we can notice is at those times, we don't suffer. No thinking, no suffering. So we can catch on to that the only thing that has the power to make us suffer is our own mind. And then we can decide how much we want to choose to believe that. Because that's actually what gives the thought power, is just the infusion of our belief. Most godlike, let there be life. Okay? And the thought puffs itself up. So if we tell ourselves scary thoughts and we believe those, sort of like ghost stories told on a dark night out in the woods, if we think, well, maybe they're true, oh my gosh, there can be fear arising, right? But at this point that we're talking about, fear is reasonable. In some ways it's because what is afraid is this sense of this personal self, this sense of me being threatened, right? Threatened with uh, demotion, right? Demotion from master to servant, and that collection of thoughts that we call our thinking mind doesn't like it, and it'll do everything in its power to keep us from going further in that direction. And one of its most effective weapons is fear. Because this is what we're actually talking about, the fear of not existing. I don't mean non-existing as in, in a nihilistic philosophy, not that at all, right? It's not existing as the fundamental entity that we believed ourselves to be. What we find out that we really are is far more wondrous, far vaster, far more inclusive. So what we give up is the sense of personal self, and what's gained is a sense of everything. Not me as a separate person holding everything. Awareness as an unlimited, formless essence, which has the capacity to contain everything. Everything appears within it. But to reach that shift of perspective, shift of identity, what is needed is this dropping of the personal self. It's related closely to personal will, right? I want what I want. I want things to be as I want them to be. You know, we can still do whatever we choose to do. It doesn't inhibit us from doing that in any way. It actually frees us to do that because we're not squandering all of our energy worrying about this outcome or that outcome. It leaves us free to act, to speak, to move, free from fear. So it's actually a liberating movement. But to make that transition, it's not something that we have the power to do, because that would again be personal will, right? It's actually happens just independent of personal will. It's not related. It's just a recognition of what we have always been. But to be willing to relinquish the sense of what we have always taken ourselves to be can require a certain willingness to move forward out of some sense that's beyond self-preservation, because we don't know what might be lost in that moving forward. The other route that most people take is to suffer enough that the only reasonable choice is just to move forward. And so sometimes we can feel ourselves coming right up to that threshold, that sort of event horizon, and then step back. And we might do that many times. And that's okay. And then one day, for whatever reason, maybe we don't. Maybe we just take that one more step, not knowing, right? Being willing to do it anyway. Being willing to move through whatever fear might be present. So in this place that we're talking about, fear is reasonable, right? It can easily arise. Um, it sort of depends on how tightly we're holding on to the idea of what we take ourselves to be. But that fear, when we're down to talking about our actual existence, that fear is not only common, but it's also indicative of being in the arena, right? Being in the territory. So it's not something to take as something going terribly wrong. I shouldn't feel fear. It's common and not unreasonable, right? Just because whatever we've taken ourselves to be as the entirety of our being, this body, mind, and we're being asked to let that go in favor of, we don't know, in favor of, we're not giving any assurances, we're not giving, any guarantees. So in some ways, it's an irrational act. It's an irrational movement that that we might take only out of desperation, having suffered enough. And if we find ourselves getting up to the frontier and backing away, maybe more suffering is needed until we come to the point where, I just have to know. I just have to know if there's something beyond this body, mind, and this tendency towards anxiety, especially as we get closer to this sense of no longer existing as a separate self. So that's the movement. And I suggest some of the more worldly senses of anxiety at the deepest level are founded on this suspicion, let's say, that what we truly are isn't just this composite of thoughts and memories and experiences, that there's not too much solid right there. And so anxiety is a recognition of that, a recognition of maybe everything I've taken myself to be and pretend to be, in order to be a, good, well-functioning adult, maybe that's not ultimately true. And so I see anxiety as a perfectly reasonable response to beginning to be willing to look at what our deepest nature is. So I love this Ajahn Chah quote. So I'll just read it again. 2 kinds of suffering: the suffering that you run away from, which follows you everywhere you go, and the suffering that you face directly, and in doing so, you become free.